What if I told you that one man's most private struggle didn't just ruin his own life, it destroyed an entire empire? This is the story of King Ferdinand II of Spain, a ruler whose reign wasn't remembered for military triumphs or golden ages, but for something far more disturbing. His legacy was built on secrets, paranoia, and an obsession with a hidden condition so bizarre that it turned the Spanish court into a theatre of humiliation. Ferdinand's tragedy wasn't just personal. His dysfunction, whispered about in every palace corridor, slowly unraveled Spain from the inside out. Wives were broken, allies turned against him, and by the time of his death, his shame had become a state secret guarded by the Vatican itself. But how did one man's private torment become the downfall of a kingdom that once ruled half the world? And what shocking discoveries about his life are still hidden away centuries later? Spain was once the most powerful empire on earth. For centuries, its ships carried gold and silver across the oceans, its armies dominated Europe, and its monarchs sat at the centre of global politics. But by the time Ferdinand II rose to power, the empire was already crumbling. Wars had drained its treasury, colonies were breaking away, and revolution was spreading like fire. And at the heart of this decline sat a king with a secret that no ruler could afford to carry. Ferdinand suffered from an anatomical curse so strange that it made intimacy nearly impossible. It wasn't just a private embarrassment, it was a royal disaster. In an age when producing heirs was the single most important duty of a monarch, Ferdinand's condition meant the survival of his dynasty was constantly in doubt. Whispers began spreading through the Spanish court. Servants, advisors, even foreign diplomats hinted that the king's most personal struggle was the real reason Spain's throne stood on shaky ground. His body, his shame, and his paranoia were about to shape the fate of an empire. But this wasn't just a story of one man's biology. It was the story of how his attempts to hide it, and to fix it, would spiral into obsession, betrayal, and tragedy. When Ferdinand first married Isabella, the Spanish court expected the union to secure the dynasty and restore stability to the throne. But behind the palace doors, the reality was something very different. On their wedding night, Isabella discovered the king's secret, a condition so shocking it left her horrified. What should have been a moment of intimacy turned into fear and confusion. She avoided him, made excuses, and soon the palace was buzzing with rumours about why the marriage remained childless. For Isabella, every encounter with her husband felt less like marriage and more like a nightmare she couldn't escape. For Ferdinand, her terror was a constant reminder of his failure as both a husband and a king. The whispers spread quickly, and what should have remained private became public scandal. And yet, instead of finding compassion, Ferdinand only grew more bitter and paranoid. If his first wife was too afraid, maybe his second would treat his condition differently, but what came next would drag him even deeper into obsession. After Isabella, Ferdinand was desperate to prove himself. The court whispered, the nobles mocked, and his enemies quietly celebrated his weakness. To silence them all, he remarried, hoping a new wife would erase the shame of the first. But instead of finding redemption, Ferdinand walked straight into a trap. His second wife came from a deeply religious background, and in her world, his condition wasn't just an unfortunate flaw. It was seen as a punishment from God. Each failed night was interpreted as divine judgment, and she pushed him toward confession, prayer, and rituals meant to clear his sin. Rather than helping, this only deepened his paranoia. Ferdinand became convinced that the heavens themselves had cursed him. Instead of love or companionship, his marriage turned into a twisted theatre of humiliation where every attempt at intimacy was shadowed by guilt and shame. The Spanish court, meanwhile, grew restless. Nobles gossiped that their king was unfit to rule, and foreign powers began questioning the stability of his dynasty. And yet Ferdinand clung to hope. If faith couldn't save him, perhaps medicine, or something far more dangerous, could. By the time Ferdinand entered his third marriage, whispers about his condition had become impossible to ignore. Diplomats joked about it in secret letters, and rival courts spread rumours that Spain's king was cursed. Desperate to silence the humiliation, Ferdinand turned to the one thing that seemed modern, progressive, and terrifying: science. Physicians from across Europe were summoned to Madrid, each promising miracle cures. Some spoke of strange surgeries, others of bizarre mechanical devices meant to correct his body. What unfolded behind closed doors was less medicine and more nightmare. Crude instruments, dangerous procedures, and experiments that left Ferdinand in agony became part of his daily life. His third wife, far from offering comfort, became a witness to this horror show. Every failed attempt, every painful experiment pushed her further away until she too saw her husband not as a king, but as a broken man trapped in a cycle of humiliation. And yet Ferdinand refused to give up. Each failure only fueled his obsession, convincing him that somewhere out there was a cure that would restore his manhood and save his throne. But the more he searched, the more his court began to see him as something far worse than weak. They began to see him as unfit to rule. Just when it seemed Ferdinand's curse would doom his dynasty forever, the impossible happened. His fourth wife shocked the entire court with an announcement no one thought they'd ever hear. She was pregnant. For the first time in years, Spain buzzed with hope. The whispers of humiliation faded, replaced by celebrations of a miracle. Maybe the king wasn't broken after all. Maybe the empire could be saved. But behind the smiles and parades, fear lingered. The pregnancy was fragile, surrounded by speculation and doubt. Physicians kept constant watch, courtiers held their breath, and Ferdinand clung to the belief that this child would finally secure his legacy. Then came the tragedy. The child, his long-awaited heir, did not survive. In an instant, the miracle turned to mourning, and the king's short-lived redemption collapsed into despair. For Ferdinand, this was more than personal heartbreak. It was confirmation of every whisper, every rumour, every cruel joke. The dynasty's survival was slipping away, and with it, Spain's last chance at stability. What began as a flicker of hope ended as the most devastating blow of his reign. By the time Ferdinand entered his fourth marriage, the Spanish court was exhausted. Every union had ended in failure, scandal, or tragedy. Yet the king still believed that one more wife might bring the miracle he desperately needed. But instead of hope, this marriage quickly became a cruel joke. His new queen, young and ambitious, seemed less interested in her husband's struggles and more concerned with her own power. Behind closed doors, she mocked his condition, turning his most painful secret into a weapon. Servants whispered that she ridiculed him to her ladies-in-waiting, while foreign envoys reported that the marriage was little more than theatre. For Ferdinand, this wasn't just another disappointment. It was humiliation on the grandest scale. The one person who was supposed to shield him from gossip had become the source of it. What remained of his dignity unravelled, and with it, the respect of his court. Now the once mighty king of Spain was trapped in a nightmare of his own making, mocked by his wife, pitied by his allies, and remembered not for his rule but for his curse. As Ferdinand's condition became impossible to ignore, the Spanish crown launched a campaign of silence. What should have been a private matter was now treated as a state secret. Anyone who dared whisper about the king's curse risked punishment. Servants were monitored, letters were intercepted, and foreign diplomats were warned to keep their reports vague or face exile. The royal court transformed into a fortress of surveillance. Spies listened in on conversations, physicians were sworn to secrecy under threat of death, and even members of the nobility learned to speak in careful riddles whenever the king's name came up. The humiliation of one man had become the paranoia of an entire empire. And yet, the more the crown tried to bury the truth, the louder the rumours grew outside palace walls. In taverns, in marketplaces, even in the streets of Rome, people whispered about the broken Spanish king. For every secret Ferdinand tried to silence, a dozen more surfaced. It wasn't just his body that was failing, it was his power, and no amount of guards, spies, or secrecy could stop the empire from collapsing under the weight of a secret everyone already knew. In 1833, King Ferdinand's troubled reign came to an end, but even in death, his secret refused to stay buried. Physicians conducted an autopsy, and what they found confirmed the rumours that had haunted him his entire life. The king's body carried the curse that had shattered marriages, fueled scandals, and destabilized a kingdom. The findings were quietly recorded, then locked away, guarded not just by Spain, but by the Vatican itself. Officials feared that if the truth ever spread unchecked, it would forever stain the monarchy. For centuries, those documents remained sealed, hidden from the public eye, as if the empire itself wanted to erase Ferdinand's humiliation from history. Yet history never forgets. Today, Ferdinand, who too is remembered less for his rule and more for the secret he tried so desperately to conceal. His story became a cautionary tale of how a monarch's private struggle, twisted by paranoia and shame, could alter the destiny of an empire. In the end, Ferdinand's legacy wasn't one of conquest or glory, but of secrecy, humiliation, and tragedy. A king whose most guarded secret became the very thing that defined him forever. Above all, the story of Ferdinand II is more than a tale about one man's private curse. It's a reminder of how personal struggles, when hidden behind walls of secrecy and shame, can shape the fate of entire nations. His marriages collapsed, his dynasty crumbled, and an empire that once ruled the world was left haunted by whispers instead of triumphs. In the end, Ferdinand wasn't destroyed by war, rebellion, or foreign enemies. He was undone by the secret he could never escape. And centuries later, his name remains a symbol of how power means nothing when it's built on silence, fear, and humiliation. So the question remains, was Ferdinand truly a victim of cruel fate, or the architect of his own downfall? History may never agree on the answer, but one thing is certain: some legacies are written not in gold, but in secrets.